Welcome to the Strategic Treasurer podcast, your source for interesting Treasury news in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
When it comes to cybercrime, organizations often emphasize the IT components of security response and prevention. The human side is rarely considered, at least not as deeply or as carefully. This common oversight has left organizations more vulnerable to attack. If the systems are systematically updated, the humans operating those systems should be as well. Preventing fraud and understanding how to respond to cyber threats can either stop a loss or at least provide the best opportunity for recovery. On this episode of the Treasury Update podcast, Jeffery of Strategic Treasurer talks with Tom Gregory, who serves as the head of Treasury Management Sales at TDBank. Listen in as they discuss today's fraud environment and a range of real-life fraud cases. You'll hear examples of both positive and not so positive results to provide guidance to you and your organization.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Jeffery. I'm here with Tom Gregory, who's the head of Treasury Management Sales at TDBank. Our topic today is IT and the human element of protecting your assets. Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, Tom.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
The concept of fraud is pretty well known. There's a large number of incidents that occur, and we'll talk about some of those mini case studies that you can share about. But sometimes there's a focus on the technology side instead of the human side, and both elements are important. You want to make sure both of those are developed. And so this overweighting on the tech side sometimes leaves people with significant exposure, and sometimes there's attitudes that aren't as mature. So I wanted to get started with that and have you weigh in on the human element of protecting the organization's assets, accounts, and transactions.
So, Craig, as you know, you and I have talked a lot about this over the last few years, and there is no letting up on the number of businesses of all sizes that are experiencing attacks on them by criminals. And I regret to say many of them continue to be victimized, not only by the attack itself, but their sustaining financial losses. There has been much more in all forms of messaging relative to the risks that exist out there, risk to consumers and businesses alike. You would expect then that financial executives would have by now responded and would have taken what I think are pretty simple, low-cost steps to protect their organizations from this kind of thing. But I think we have a very long way to go. Businesses continue to be duped into what we call business email compromise, and they're duped as a result of having had their computers compromised, and the criminals are able to piece together enough components of their identity to make them believe that they're corresponding with perhaps a vendor or an executive, and at some point in time, they will follow what appears to be a valid payment order from a vendor or an executive and actually initiate a wire transfer or an ACH to a criminal's account. That could have been prevented by doing simple things to have prevented the original compromise of the computer in the first place. That's the thing that really has me concerned. I think that there just needs to be more messaging, more education, more evangelism out there, because too many businesses are learning the hard way what they can be doing without a whole lot of disruption to their everyday businesses to protect themselves. And these things, you and I talk about the human element of protecting the company's assets that go along with all of the technology elements that we know to be available to us, like firewalls and passwords and things of that nature.
Tom, your point is a good one, that there's no letting up on whatever size the businesses are, and I really appreciate your warning and caution how some organizations aren't putting the time, effort, or education into doing the things they need to protect organizations, because the criminals are after every size organization because they can be very efficient with it. You described the business email compromise where someone takes over an email or spoofs somebody into thinking that this email is from an executive or a key vendor, and they change the payables record to go to a new account, usually bypassing their controls, or there's this emergency payment that needs to be made. And since it came from an executive and it looks almost exactly the same, has the same language, sometimes it comes from their email, these are often acted upon. I just wonder if you could go through an example. I know you can't mention individual clients, of course, but there's a number of situations that I think the broader audience will benefit from. And sure, we've heard about system-level compromise, we've heard about business email compromise, check fraud. But let's go through an example. What's the situation and what the result was?
Yeah, I'll give you a few. And you're right to your point. There's not a whole heck of a lot of difference relative to small, mid-sized, or big corporations. Although we have seen sometimes a difference in how those businesses react. What I think anyone would characterize as a large institution was victim to almost $1 million an email sent to someone who has payment initiation authority on their bank's commercial online banking system, received an email from the CFO of the company. Actually, he believed it to be an email that came from the CFO of the company. And it had very specific instructions to disperse almost $1 million. And the money left, and they lost it for good. We learned about it several weeks after it had happened, and the institution essentially was embarrassed about it. They knew right away that they had been duped, and it was very unlikely that the monies would have been gotten back, given the time frames involved. But we always want for our customers to call us so that we can just activate our global security investigations staff, activate the FBI, get to the consulates in foreign lands, and from time to time, if we act fast enough, we can get the funds frozen before they are extricated from the payment systems by the downstream mules. This institution, they realized that they were victimized. They didn't want the headline risk associated with it. We think that they should have called us immediately. We had another one where and this would be characterized as a mid-sized company. There was an email exchange between a perpetrator and somebody on the finance staff. The perpetrator of the crime had, through social engineering and through phishing, been able to get all sorts of information about a relationship between an actual supplier to this company and the company, and engaged this principal in an email-based dialogue that carried really no stakes to it at all. It was simple a discussion about some business matters. But along the way, perhaps a month into this periodic engagement, there was almost an, oh, by the way, we've changed our account. Could you update your vendor master in payables? Just based on that email request, the company changed the payee information associated with the supplier. They timed the crime so that there would be a payment for an invoice that was, of course, fraudulent, and the money would go out literally the afternoon before Thanksgiving, so Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Of course, the company didn't put two and two together that this was a crime until Monday afternoon after the holiday. And they did call the bank, and we, mobilized our forces. Unfortunately, it was too late. That was too many days that went by, and it gave the criminals much more time than they would have reasonably needed to get the monies out of the payment systems. So the way that these criminals are able to get this information is oftentimes because they've been able to have the victim open up an email, click on a link, and it downloads software that's now going to track every keystroke that they make, and so they're able to track their normal and customary emails back and forth. So they know who's who. They can find actually the writing style and jargon that principals are using in everyday business. And so the criminals are no longer trying to hack into a bank's online payment system. They've hacked into the company's computer and have been able to use the information that they've stolen to trick the victim into, sending a wire or an ACH to an account somewhere. So it isn't like the criminals are taking the money from the account. The owners of the account are sending the money to the criminal's account. And so that's sort of the most prevalent form of these fraudulent schemes that we're seeing. Although a few years ago, the prevailing fraud was where the criminals were trying to intervene in the commercial online banking systems used by financial professionals. They would achieve what was and still is called a man in the middle. So once the customer looks to sign on to their banking system, they may be faced with a screen that looks all fine and normal, but essentially they're being invited to hand over control of the banking system to the criminal. We haven't seen much of that in several years, though we have seen one instance of it with a company that I would say is not small business, but maybe just below mid-sized. In that case, I was astounded at the response by the victim. They really saw nothing wrong with doing things like accessing online banking in a public setting, using a free Wi-Fi in a retail location, and that's where I was saying earlier. You would think that after all this time, after all this stimuli in society around the risks, especially financial managers will have gotten further along in their understanding and awareness. I mean, really, the sharing of duties between the bank and the caretakers of the payment systems and the users of the payment systems, it really is skewed towards the banks and payment systems themselves. And all of the infrastructure, all of the prevention and detection infrastructure that we have in place, it does a heck of a lot to protect the entire system. But the actual users have to do what I think is a modest amount of protections to sort of close the loop, do things like pick up the phone to authenticate a large wire. The CFO is asking me to send this wire. Did it through email. Email schemes have been going on now for decades. Pick up the phone and just check. Look at bank accounts every day. You don't have to do a reconcilement, but inspect bank accounts every day. If there's an anomaly, escalate it. Perhaps have a design structure in place for your accounts. If you need an account for something, well, open that account and only have it be able to do that something. If you're never going to pay an incoming ACH debit, tell your bank to block any and all ACH debits. If you're not going to write checks out of that account, put a check block on it. And so there are lots of simple things that one, at least this person here, would expect to have come a whole lot further than we've come. Banks really mean it when they say they're in the relationship business, Craig. And this should be like a good thing where we together make sure that everything's buttoned up relative to protecting the company's assets. You know, we should feel good together that we're closing these loops. But all too often, when the company is victimized, oftentimes their first inclination is to say, well, my bank didn't protect me. And then after a while, they're learning, as I said earlier, the hard way that it wasn't the bank that was compromised. It was I who was compromised. And the control weaknesses were actually here on my end, not at the bank. And I don't want to make this sound like we're sort of in an adversarial mode here all the time. I think oftentimes, we have lots of experiences here where the company does call the bank and we are able to recover the funds and we all feel good, and it ends up being a relationship reinforcement experience. But it is really telling, this Treasury Perspective survey that Craig, you and Strategic Treasurer completed last year. I jotted down a couple of things. When you compare corporates to banks on these questions, we require employees to take training on security and regulations. 31% of corporates said never, and 0% of banks said never. And 39% of corporates said annually, 89% of banks said annually. Do you require employees involved in payments to take security training each year? 61% of corporates said no. 97% of banks said yes. Does training have a reported test component? So for corporates where 61% don't have security training, for those that do, 34% of those do not have a training component. With banks that say, 97% of banks say, we do security training. 94% say, yes, that has a component to it. So I think that, clearly banks are in the business of protecting assets. So that's our sort of core competency. But when you think about those statistics, it supports my argument that many, I'm not generalizing, but too many corporates have not yet put in place sufficient business routines, control layers, a purposeful approach to this topic by having a regimen, a discipline around training, a rhythm to inspecting accounts, a periodic risk assessment of their account structure and their treasury operation, and anything that has to do with money movement. So these statistics just, I think, bear out what I've been saying. We still have a long way to go, and so to my banker colleagues out there, you may feel like you've been talking about these topics and ACH positive pay and multi-factor authentication until you're blue in the face, but we have not yet moved enough of society yet to have succeeded in what we need to do.
I think that's a really good point. That the perspective of some people is that, the bank's going to protect us, they're going to make us whole, is well, it's naive. Just because the bank may have a lot of money doesn't mean you're just going to hand it over because you decided to ship money off because you got fooled or spoofed, as terrible as it is, and you sent $500,000, $5 million to an account controlled by a criminal who was able to get it out of the banking system. And this idea that you're talking about, the human element being responsible for protecting what they have and staying on top of what they have is really borne out by the differences between how well prepared banks are, how well the banks are training their people, and how well different people in finance and treasury are actively pursuing these things. So that is definitely an aspirational goal, to get everyone caught up so that they're acting more like the banks in those regards. Tom, you said a couple things earlier. I just wanted to talk on that. Maybe you could jump in. You gave an example, and the fraud included a technology component. They were able to put some sort of payload to monitor a system. They waited a long time. In other words, they engaged in a conversation, I think, back and forth, discussing work and non-work things. And then timing-wise, they hit right before a long holiday. And, the concept of they're patient now, not like before. They're not just looking to take $500. They want to take $500,000, $5 million, $50 million, and they'll be patient for that. And part of their challenge is they have to get money to accounts they control and then get that money out of the banking system. That becomes much more difficult when it's a large sum of money. So I think you mentioned earlier some people were embarrassed and didn't call the bank. While the bank, I guess they knew that your bank wasn't responsible for it because they had been duped. You had made a comment about they should have called you earlier. So maybe you just describe why that's important. Even if the horse has left the barn, the sooner you contact the bank, the more likely it is you'll recover some or perhaps all of that money.
That's right. Frankly, if it's an outgoing wire, your chances are a lot less than if we're talking about an ACH. As you know, wires they're immediate, they're real time, they're final once they hit the receiving bank. From time to time, however, we are able to get to the beneficiary bank and at least have them freeze the funds. And if that happens, then we have a pretty good chance at recovery, which can be a lengthy process.
Well, let me jump in there for a second. I mean, the idea you let the other bank that received the funds, even if they have been able to exfiltrate some of the money out of the banking system, it's going to flag that account and prevent them from using that account that they control, and it shuts down that avenue. So you're doing a good service to the community of honest people, honest communities. Back to you, Tom. I think you had an additional follow-up.
Yeah. So let's stay with that example of where a company was victimized and they didn't call the bank. I get that. They probably wouldn't have gotten a recovery anyhow. But we tell everyone, as soon as you suspect an anomaly, escalate it, get to the bank. We see ACH fraud as well. Some of our customers had contacted us to tell us that their accounts paid ACH debits that were fraudulent. And they were really mad at us because they had put filters on their account to only pay incoming debits that they had authorized.
Yeah, so Tom, just explain the filters. Not everyone's a master at that. This is a filter to do what? How does that work?
Yeah, so you have an account, and you may be allowing another party to get paid by you by sending a debit to your account. A lot of companies pay their employee employee withholding taxes that way. Taxing authorities will send a debit to the company's account. And so if you have a control-minded approach to managing your bank accounts, any account that you have that you haven't given anyone authority to come in and debit you with, you should tell your bank to block those accounts from paying any incoming ACH debits. And if you have accounts where you do allow others, maybe your payroll vendor gets funded that way, the taxes that I talked about earlier. You may even pay vendors that way. You may be on some sort of monthly plan that you allow for a monthly debit. Well, then banks offer blocks and filters, and they offer ACH positive pay. With filters, you tell your bank, only pay ACH debits that come from these originators. Now, sometimes a taxing authority may come at you with a different originator ID from time to time, and so we advocate that our customers use something called ACH positive pay. Essentially, it says whether you have filters or not, we're going to show you via your online banking system or an alert that debits have been presented to your account, especially if they're debits that you haven't set up filters for. And then this will give you, the account owner, the opportunity to approve that and say, yeah, that one's good. It's the state of whatever. They must be using a different ID. I'll call them and make sure that that's true. Or they'll say, no, return this. I don't know what it is. Thank goodness. It could have been a fraud. So that's how the ACH filters and ACH positive pay works. And we actually had a company through social engineering. Someone was able to get to us a contract with Wet Ink to set up a filter, and it was filtering for a criminal activity. Now, we found a control opportunity there and closed it. But our customer, of course, they thought that the system had not worked. You know, we showed them the contract that it looked like it had the signature of the owner. Now, mind you, some organizations post the CFO and the CEO's signatures online. There's a lot of information about people who have signing authorities and their company's bank accounts. They're out on LinkedIn. So at any rate, this criminal sent debits, and those debits got paid. And of course, the company wanted to hold the bank responsible. And since this was an incoming unauthorized debit, it was unauthorized because our customer told us that they didn't authorize it, we were able to simply invoke a NACHA rule, the National ACH Association, that's about 3 years old or so, to require the originating bank to produce a copy of the authorization agreement between the sender of the debit and my customer, who was the receiver of the debit. And of course, the bank couldn't produce that, and so they knew that they had allowed a criminal to send fraudulent transactions through them. And in the ACH, the originating banks warrant the validity of everything they send into the network. So that bank reimbursed my customer. Actually, they reimbursed TDBank, who in turn reimbursed our customer. And when a contact of theirs learned about this, they contacted us and said, the same thing happened to us. Do you think you can help us too? And we said, yes, we can. Why didn't you call us when it happened? And they said, because we don't use ACH positive pay, so we figured we were liable because we didn't have that control in place that you told us we should have in place. So again, had they not called us, they would have been out the money that was eminently recoverable, and so therefore, you know, we invoke the same right in the ACH to go to the originating bank, ask for the authorization agreement between the sender and receiver, and of course they didn't have that. That bank also found a new opportunity to add another layer of control, which you and I know is really the key to success. It's the continuous layering into the control environment that keeps us usually half a step ahead of the criminals.
Yeah, or you don't make the same mistake twice. I think there's a mountain of things we can learn from this example. I'll just step through them. I smile when you tell me this. First, thank you, Tom, for sharing this example of a layer that was defeated. I mean, it was a layer that was defeated on the bank side, and you guys fixed it and you described it, and that is one attempt of how criminals do. You might have multiple layers of protection, and they try to defeat those, and so they'll figure those things out. So you got to keep each of your layers safe so that you don't do that. So one, thank you for sharing that. The second has to do with the human element, which was one of them contacted you and they were mad, but they contacted you right away and you were able to follow up on it. And the other heard about it and then they were able to follow up. And that's another human part, is why don't you call the bank? And why aren't you learning or take the steps to contact the bank, take the steps to learn what's going on and what your rights are and what the opportunities are, even though the liability may have fallen completely on that second company's plate. They still can call you, and as a bank, you can follow up and perhaps recover some or all of the money. It's not lost just because you may bear the responsibility. The third thing I'll say, and maybe this is something you really can't say, Tom, as a banker, is that sometimes people have the attitude that it's always the bank's responsibility. Why would I pay for these protection services that give me a cost, and it's really the responsibility of the bank, because as long as I reconcile within a month or within a reasonable period of time, all of the liability is going to fall on the bank side. One, that's not always true, and oftentimes it's not true. Two, you may not be using commercially reasonable procedures. And third, and finally, it is incumbent upon people to take the necessary steps. And so just because a bank is telling you this is a good security service, it doesn't mean that they're going to get rich off of the 5 cents or the $10 or whatever the amount is for these protection items. They are for your good, to maintain a good and stable relationship. So listen to your banks when they offer these services, ask questions, and employ them, because the attacks are quite consistent, and just the time wasted, even if it gets blocked, the time wasted on following up on these is massive. So it's very much in your interest to put those in place.
I think that when we talk about the things that users should be doing, there's only a few things that the bank is quote unquote selling and asking to get paid for. Much of what we're advocating for are basic practices and behaviors, where we're not asking anyone to fork over any fees or money for it. To your point about the commercially reasonable procedures, I'll tell you, in the preponderance of cases, a bank can prove that commercially reasonable procedures weren't being followed. But that's not how we want to relate with our customers, by looking at what the contract says when something goes wrong. As you've heard me say many times, when we have a customer who is upset, they've just been robbed. Well, maybe robbed is the wrong word, but they've been violated, they've lost money, and their first inclination is to say to the bank, "You're going to make me whole for this, right?" I never start by saying, "Well, look at what your contract says, and you're going to find that you didn't do your part." That's not how we like to do business. And as you've heard me say many times, the first thing I say is, "Look, we're going to do the right thing. We just have to figure out what that thing is." But I will tell you that as you are distilling out of a lot of what I've been saying into some sort of simple messages and object lessons, I would offer that one would be, when you sign a banking agreement, read it and make sure that you understand it and review it with your banker. This is just not boilerplate stuff that is gibberish. It really is inclined to make sure that the parties know their responsibilities and are contractually bound to those duties. So if you look at any bank's standard agreements for treasury management services, for commercial online banking, it will say that commercially reasonable procedures are expected on both parties. And with TD, we actually talk about what some of those things are, and we point to best practices and guidelines which change from time to time. And it's not legalese. It says simple things like, do not change your online banking password for other applications. Never access bank, brokerage, or financial services information at public locations such as internet cafes, public libraries, etc. Prohibit the use of shared usernames and passwords for online banking systems. These aren't services I'm selling. These are just fundamental practices and protections that, if followed, the likelihood of sustaining a loss are like dramatically reduced. As I said many times already today, all too many people are learning that the hard way.
You gave an example before too of just connecting to any Wi-Fi that's open, and kids do that all the time. It's rather amazing. I know we keep our kids' computer completely separate. They don't have access to the adult computers at home because they will click anywhere and do anything. At the same time, people will travel on business. They'll go into the airport lounge made up of oftentimes many executives, high net worth individuals, and just quickly click and connect, or they'll connect to any coffee shop where someone could be sitting in the car, turns on a network and puts a sniffer on it so it can read the traffic that's going across. Very easy to get people to connect these things and start reading unsecured traffic, whereas, like you said, you have a standard of good corporate conduct telling your customers, pay attention, why not use your hotspot on your phone to connect that is secure, not anything out there that just happens to be available.
Well, yeah, and I'm saying read this information before you start using your online banking. If you're signing up for, you're choosing or changing a bank, and they're giving you their master agreement, their account disclosures, read them and know what is expected of you and do those things. And it will create eminently more protections than if you are simply signing what you think is boilerplate and going about your life and doing things like accessing the computer that you use for banking in public locations like you just described. We really believe that at some point in the future, it's going to become more and more the convention that businesses designate computers for payment activity. Say, if you want to make payments, go into that locked room and use that computer.
It is becoming more popular to do that. It's not mainstream, but you can certainly see if you have no access to email, it prevents that possibility. Tom, our topic was technology and IT components, the human element in IT. We also talked about services, and you brought in another layer that's probably good for another discussion. You talked about your banking account structure, how you manage and monitor your accounts. Those all represent perimeter activities as well, just like your network might have a firewall to prevent people from getting into your corporate network. You have your banking structure, the controls around there from filters, blocks, visibility that also help provide protection. So a whole set of things for another conversation. And I really appreciate your comments about the human element in some of these real-life examples of fraud, what was done, how it could have been done better. Do you have anything else to leave those listeners to the Treasury Update podcast with today? Any final Tom Gregory insights?
Wish you'd asked me that earlier. It would have been juicy. But but no, I do want to reiterate, especially the larger banks that are, the biggest participants in the world's payment systems. We have experienced over the years that protecting the payment systems, protecting the company, protecting our customers has been transformed from a set of discrete functions to more of a strand of the DNA of our culture. That is true here at TDBank, and I dare say it's probably true at most larger banks, that no matter what your job is at the bank, you have, you just know it's not necessarily a task-oriented thing. You just know that part of our duties as professionals are to think in a risk-minded way and to act that way, to be risk managers. And my parting sentiment, I would urge any and all companies to embrace that idea. As much as you believe servicing your customers runs in your veins, have protecting your customers, protecting your company's assets, have that be another strand of the DNA of your culture, of your company. And so it won't be the top 10 things I need to do to protect my company's assets. It'll be just what we do naturally to protect the company, the payment systems, and society from these really bad people that are getting rich in some ways pretty easily with these online crimes.
Excellent points, Tom. Thank you for spending some of your afternoon with me on this topic, and everyone, thank you for listening to this version of the Treasury Update podcast.
Have a great day, everybody.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only. Statements made by any representative of TDBank N.A. or its affiliates during this podcast are not intended to provide tax, legal, business, or accounting advice. Listeners are encouraged to seek guidance from their financial planner, investment advisor, or other appropriate professional. Member FDIC. For more information, visit tdbank.com. Statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC are also for informational purposes and are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.